Welcome everyone to our webinar, Community Engagement Strategies for Early Stage Solar and Wind Projects. This session is being recorded and we will email the link out to all attendees when it is available. We'll have time for questions at the end, so feel free to leave questions in the chat, but we will be responding at the end of the presentation. So we'll get started with an introduction of our first speaker. Timberly Ross is Senior Director of Community Relations in Tenaska's development group. She oversees community engagement and stakeholder relationships to support the company's development activities across the U.S. This encompasses solar, wind, battery storage, natural gas, carbon capture, and storage and hydrogen projects. She is responsible for developing and executing strategic community engagement and communications plans that align with development milestones and foster a positive environment for energy development. Timberly, take it away.
Thanks, Ethan. Hello, everyone. I am Timberly Ross. I'm with Tenaska. I've been with the company for 12 years. And in my current role, I lead the community relations function across our development business. Before joining the company, I was a journalist for more than 10 years, including at the Associated Press. So I bring a lot of the skills from that career to Tenaska's strategic approach to community relations, which includes how, when, and with whom we communicate with about our development projects. So a little bit about Tenaska. We are one of the largest private companies in the United States. We are headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska, where I am based. Our second largest office is in the greater Dallas area, but we have regional offices and plant locations across the country. We've been around for 35 plus years, and we actually started by developing natural gas power plants. And we've evolved since then into other parts of the energy space. Our affiliate Tenaska Marketing Ventures is one of the largest natural gas marketers in North America, and affiliate Tenaska Power Services is best in class as a power marketer and energy manager. On the development side of our business, we've grown from developing just natural gas power plants to also developing renewables, green hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage. We have touched in some way 22,000 megawatts of generation since our founding, and our current development portfolio includes about 180 projects totaling about 40,000 megawatts. And this includes a large number of projects that Tenaska is developing on behalf of other customers. So to provide some context around community engagement, I think it's first important to look at the opposition to renewables projects. We are seeing opposition to renewables, and really to most large-scale energy and infrastructure projects is on the rise. And there's a steady stream of news headlines like the ones you're seeing here that highlights this growing opposition. And as a community relations professional who has worked on some oppositional projects, the job really is getting harder every day for developers. Earlier this year, the USA Today released an analysis that showed more than 1,000 counties across the US host solar, and 116 of those counties have restrictions on solar, with half of those passed last year alone. And we already are seeing a lot of counties enacting similar moratoriums this year. And then also some recent research from Lawrence Berkeley shows that developers have self-reported that about a third of wind and solar siting applications submitted in the past 5 years were canceled, and a good number were delayed 6 months or more. And the top reasons were zoning and community opposition. And those two things really go hand in hand, because your community sentiment really is reflected in what your zoning ordinance is and the zoning process. So there are several reasons why this opposition is growing, and I'm going to touch on just a few, but please know that there are many, many others. First, some of the opposition really is self-inflicted. There has been an explosive growth in renewables in parts of the country that really haven't seen much development in the past. And those communities feel unprepared for this and are very apprehensive about what this new development can mean for their community identity and their community culture. And then there are some developers who don't put their best foot forward in terms of community engagement. There are projects that just don't work out too, for various circumstances, and communities are disappointed. But in either case, it makes it harder for new developers when they come back to those areas. Politics. Energy and politics are increasingly entwined. We know this when it comes to state and federal energy policy, but we're also seeing it on the local level as well. Americans have different opinions about wind and solar, natural gas, and developers really need to separate their projects from the political discourse. They need to show that these projects will be beneficial to communities, and why they should support them. And then we all know that social media really is a bastion of misinformation and disinformation, and provides a platform for opposition groups to mobilize. But we are seeing a growing emphasis on community engagement across the industry, and more developers are adding community relations personnel to their development teams. So that's good news. But why? Other than this opposition, really, local sentiment is a project risk, and it is hard to mitigate. It can be expensive to mitigate. And really, a developer can do everything right when it comes to community engagement and still have project opponents. You can't force someone to like you, and you certainly can't force someone to like a wind farm or a solar field in their community, regardless of what changes may be made to the project design or to the community benefits. So that sentiment really has a definite impact on which projects are successful and which ones aren't. Developers really need to have a robust community engagement plan to build support, to respond to questions and concerns, and demonstrate that they want to be a good business neighbor. And those relationships, they don't happen overnight. You have to put in an effort to build relationships. You have to be strategic, and you really have to do it in person too. I think that's critically important, to have people on the ground. And then deciding when to start your community engagement campaign is critically important. And it really is more art than science. There's not a good formula for when you do it, but you have to consider how confident you are in your project. You want to have the pieces of your project put together, be able to answer some of the key questions like, where is your project? What is the timeline for your project? And because if you don't have some of those answers, you kind of breed some skepticism. But at the same time, you don't want to wait too late. There'll be rumors going around, and once rumors and concerns start, it really is hard to get over that hurdle. So you really got to pay attention to when the right time is, and then be ready to commit the resources. Because once you start that public-facing community engagement, it's something you just have to keep doing. It doesn't serve developers well if they start a public-facing campaign and then go quiet for a while. That tends to draw questions about the viability of the project. So when I think of the key components of a community engagement plan, there are a few things that are top of mind. Knowledge of the community. It sounds cliche, but every community is unique and every development project is unique. And so your engagement plan must be reflective of those things. Targeted stakeholder outreach. So local leaders, participating landowners, neighbors, the community at large. Each of those audience has its own relationship to the project and has different communications needs. So local leaders may have a permitting authority over a project. They may help the county benefit from those community benefits, but they also have constituents to respond to as well. And then, of course, landowners stand to benefit financially from the project. So you need to be responsive to the needs of each audience, engage them at the appropriate time, and provide information that's relevant to them and their role. Tenaska's community engagement approach is rooted in clear, effective, and timely communications. And the act of communicating with your stakeholders demonstrates respect and sincerity, that you take the time to share information in a manner that's understandable to the layperson, that answers questions, that responds to concerns, And so that communication means a lot when it's done with that sincerity and timeliness. Local presence. You need to demonstrate that you intend to be a good business neighbor and being a part of the community. And you do that and you build relationships by having a local presence. You need team members who will be on the ground, who are accessible, and are seen integrating into the community. Tenaska often, and in many of our communities, also opens a local office to further demonstrate our commitment to being there long term. And then a mutually beneficial project. This means one that's going to have a positive impact on the community. And I'll come back to this a minute on when we get to the next slide, because that really will hit on community benefits. But first, flexibility is critically important in a community engagement plan. Different things are going to happen and evolve over the course of development. There'll be challenges and opportunities, questions that come up. And so your plan needs to be flexible and responsive. And so I never would go into a community with a plan that I expect is going to cover the full course of development. I've got an initial plan that might cover the first 6 months, but really beyond that, you have to evolve your plan to meet the local needs. So community benefits. This is what I meant about delivering a mutually beneficial project. Being able to express the community benefits to key stakeholders and to the community is incredibly important. There are project-specific benefits like landowner lease payments, tax revenue, construction and operations jobs, and opportunities for contractors and vendors over the life of the project. And then there are other types of benefits, being able to attract other forms of economic development. Oftentimes new companies, data centers, et cetera, they want to locate in places where there are renewables. And so having a renewables facility in your community makes it attractive to that extra development. A developer's community giving program makes them attractive as well. That can be donations and sponsorships or community funds. And then community partnerships, such as collaborating with first responder programs or local schools. And so more and more, developers need to express these benefits early in the process to get community buy-in. But it can be hard to define these benefits early in the development when there's still a lot of variability to the project, even if your footprint still is changing a little bit. So, SER has studied the economic benefits of various wind and solar projects that Tenaska has developed. And these are professional, credible studies based on defined inputs that the developer provides. And we typically like to commission these for use to educate and build support ahead of a permitting process. But we have been seeing more and more that communities want to know those benefits much, much earlier, perhaps even when we're in the initial land campaign. And so it doesn't really make sense for us to commission a full economic benefit study at that time because those project details may change. So last year, I reached out to SER about a slimmer version of that study that can be done earlier in development to provide communities a snapshot of what those project-specific economic benefits can be. And I'm going to let Bryan and Chris talk more about what those look like, but I'll just close in saying we've had really good results in using those to provide local stakeholders a glimpse of what those benefits are.
Well, thank you, Timberly. Appreciate the presentation and information. Moving into the next portion of our webinar, Bryan Loomis will be speaking on property taxes and community engagement, as well as our land use analyses. Bryan Loomis has been conducting economic impact property tax and land use analysis at Strategic Economic Research since 2019. He has performed or overseen over 100 wind and solar analyses and has also provided expert testimony for permitting hearings and open houses in many states, including Colorado, Kansas, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. He improved the property tax analysis methodology at SER by researching various state taxing laws and implementing depreciation, taxing jurisdiction millage rates, and other factors into the tax analysis tool. Before working with SER, Bryan ran a consulting agency working with over 30 technology startups on growth and marketing. Bryan received his MBA from Belmont University in 2016.
Thank you, Ethan. Hello. Thank you all for coming today. This is probably one of the only groups of people where the subject I'm talking about could be announced and we'd see no attendees drop immediately. But it is exciting to have you here. We're probably about the only group of people who's interested in this sort of stuff to the level we are, but I'm excited to be able to share with you. So getting into the property taxes here, if you could go to my next slide here. So property taxes are really one of the primary benefits to a community that you'll see from renewable energy projects. A lot of the community engagement that we do, Timberly mentioned combating misinformation. That's all on the negative side, saying what your project is not going to do or the effects that it is not going to have. So the positives of the benefits really come through property taxes, economic impacts, creation of jobs, and that sort of thing. And so property taxes are a significant piece of good news often that you can give to the local community. And the other benefit that that sometimes people don't think about renewable energy quite in this way, but the other benefit of the property taxes associated with renewable energy is that they don't create a really significant need for the community services that they're paying to the jurisdictions for. Good example of this, easy example of this is a library. You know, solar farm or a wind farm is not going to use the library, but they could be contributing significant tax dollars to that library that then benefits the community locally in terms of increased services, more revenue per resident to the library, which allows them to provide better services to the people already existing in the community. If you think about bringing in sort of steel plant or other industry that's going to cause a bigger increase in population or employment, more people moving into the area. Well, you often hear about the downside of that, of renewable energy projects aren't going to bring, as many ongoing jobs as a project like that. But you don't hear about the flip side when it comes to property tax of you're increasing your property tax significantly without bringing more people who need to use that service, which benefits the existing community that's already there. So you can go to the next slide here. So we think about community benefits without community headaches. Like I said, those local jurisdictions, getting into some other examples, the county, there is a little bit, there's more administrative work when it comes to a renewable energy project. But things like the park districts, the roads, usually you'll have, road repairs built in, road use agreements, so that ongoing payment to the road can improve the roads elsewhere, not related or not being used heavily for the construction of the project. Fire districts, the fire district will often have sort of a safety plan for the solar farm or wind farm, but those are very unlikely events. And so the services needed from the fire district with regards to your project is going to be a much lower impact than the property taxes that that fire district is likely to receive with your project in most states. So you don't see you're not likely to see a significant increase in the services needed from those jurisdictions. You are likely to see an increase in the tax revenue available for those jurisdictions. School districts are another interesting case. They can see, it depends on the state. There's a lot of complications when it comes to school district funding, particularly with regards to the state aid that the school district is receiving. But in many states, school districts do see an increase in revenue without a corresponding increase in local population, maybe a very small increase, but certainly not on the level of the property tax that that school district is receiving, which can be, over half of the property tax for the project. That means more money available per student. Teachers can be paid better, facilities can be improved, textbooks can be purchased, all of those things that we associate with school district funding that are really on a per student basis. More money per student is a very good thing for a school district. So in states where they do see that extra revenue associated with a project like this coming and an increase in assessed value, then you can see some pretty big benefits to the school district there. The other thing about increasing assessed value is it gives a little bit of optionality. So jurisdictions can decide what they want to do with that increased assessed value. They can choose between increasing their revenue. So, let's say, just to talk in sort of round numbers for the sake of understanding, if a local jurisdiction currently has, 100 million in assessed value, and renewable energy project adds another 100 million of assessed value on top of that, then you can decide, do I want to leave my tax rate the same and double my revenue, which would lead to better services, or do I want to actually decrease my tax rate? And you could cut that tax rate in half, have the same amount of, work with the same budget for the jurisdiction, but the whole community benefits from that, not just the renewable energy project that's paying a lower tax rate, but everyone in the community is taxed at a lower rate, which is really a community benefit. They have to pay less tax and get the same level of services. So you do run into some situations in certain states where that's an option for jurisdictions. We're talking in generalities here. There are a lot of specifics when it comes to the state you're in and how their tax code works, how renewable energy is treated, even whether it's, I'm talking about property tax here, but sometimes it'd be considered more a generation tax or a production tax, depending on the state you're working in. But these are the themes that we see in many states where you can build a strong argument for property tax being a significant benefit to the community. You can go to the next slide here. So to talk more about these early stage or preliminary studies that Timberly mentioned that we started doing with the Tenaska team and have expanded beyond that, we're working with many developers now on these sorts of reports. And the idea was, instead of creating a report geared towards permitting and the permitting hearing, informing the zoning board and other stakeholders about economic benefits and property taxes, how can we create something that can be used earlier to quantify some of these impacts for community engagement purposes? And so the challenge here is that at an early stage, as a developer, you might have limited information on what your capital expenditures are going to look like. You almost certainly don't have the level of detail that you will later into the process. We know that those numbers fluctuate based on your costs. And so you may have limited information there. You also may have limited information on, your site plan, your area of interest. It might be a quite large area of interest and you're not sure exactly where those turbine locations are going to go, for example. And so what is not possible is the level of precision that we can do when we're going for permitting, but what is possible is to start to quantify some of these things to give an idea of the magnitude that a county can expect to receive, because numbers might go down a bit, they might go up a bit, but giving the local community an idea of, hey, here's what property taxes are likely to look like. This is the scale of the numbers that we're talking about, can be very, very impactful at an early stage, even if, once your site plan gets a little more exact and you know exactly what those distributions between the school districts are going to look like, you're going to have more information later on. But that early information, that for preliminary studies, the things that we're doing are using averages, using industry standards, taking the information that we do have and extrapolating based on that, based on other similar projects that we've seen. That'll give you a pretty good idea to where, even if it increases 20% or decreases 20%, we're still talking about sort of the same magnitude. It's in the same ballpark. And that's what's important at this point, is to give them an idea of the benefits that they can expect to receive, while making it clear that they are preliminary and we'll be able to make more precise estimates when we know more information and all of that sort of thing. So the process for this on the property tax side of things is essentially we'll need a couple of inputs from you depending on the state. Capital expenditures, it could be, the nameplate capacity of the project or the expected energy produced in year one. We can extrapolate some of that based on available information. If we don't have it, we use the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs data pretty heavily, their annual reports, to come up with, in some cases national, in some cases state specific assumptions on these things to get an idea of what those property taxes are going to look like. All right, you can go to the next slide, Ethan. In terms of so that's property taxes. Land use is another thing that's likely to come up early in the process here, and another area where you're going to want to have some answers for the community. The real question of land use that we're talking about is a solar farm, talking specifically about solar here. Wind, it tends to be less of an issue because it takes up less agricultural land. But for a solar farm, is a solar farm going to be a better use of the land in question than agricultural use will be? And so that's really what we're looking at. And you're going to want to look at this question from all perspectives. So you want to consider the landowner's perspective. Are they getting a better deal under the solar lease than they are under agricultural use? But not only the landowner, because you're going to be engaging the whole community. So you want to think about the residents and how they're going to perceive having agriculture taken out of the community. Local business owners, things like supply stores for agriculture, that are going to be worried about, selling less fertilizer, selling less pesticides and seed, selling less equipment, all of those sorts of things. Those local business owners are a perspective that needs to be considered, as well as the local business owners that stand to gain from the development of a solar project when you can source locally. And then the local governmental bodies as well. What is the impact going to look like on them in terms of land use? So it's important when we're talking about this issue that we're comparing apples to apples. And this is where we see our economic impact reports interpreted inappropriately by the community somewhat often, is when they're trying to make extrapolations or comparisons. So I'll give you a little bit of detail and then get into why it's not it's not as easy a thing to do as some in the community might assume. So a good economic impact analysis is going to take a lot of things into consideration. It's done via modeling, it's done via software that's looking at what those expected impacts are and taking a lot of things into account. One of the things that Chris will talk about in more detail are the local ripple effects of capital infusion into a county. So when you build a project, you're not only engaging direct labor, but you've also got supply chain impacts that impact local businesses. You've got induced impacts of people staying at hotels, eating at local restaurants, having more cash in their pockets that they spend locally and that sort of thing. So those are all taken into account by a good economic impact analysis. You also have the issue of leakage of expenditures outside the county or the state for when you're talking about energy. That might be things that do come up often in the community, like you're sourcing all of your equipment from outside the county or outside the state. It's a little less evident, but certainly still there for agriculture, where even if you're sourcing all of your feed or fertilizer, certainly equipment locally, you need to take into account the retail margin. And so if you buy a tractor from, a local supply store, not all of that money should be considered going locally. It should be the retail margin, because that person could have sourced from outside the county or the state when they originally bought the equipment. And so all of those things are taken into account by modeling. And so you really only want to compare the economic impact numbers from solar with other economic impact calculations that have been run through a model. We'll see a lot of times. I did some testimony back in January where I was questioned about this on the stand, sort of these back of napkin calculations of, well, your numbers say this, but I looked at the agricultural numbers and ran this quick calculation, or here are the total costs that we'd expect on a per acre basis from agricultural. Those things are not equivalent. You need to actually run a model that considers all of these things if you're going to try to compare the two. So percent purchased locally, retail margin, very important for these sorts of things. And by modeling, it allows us to account for all of the variables when it comes to these things. The last thing that's quite likely to come up in these local conversations is this issue of what are the crops actually getting used for? This idea that local agriculture is important to hang on to, the idea that we're feeding the world with this and we need to continue agricultural production. We can't take this land out of production. It's very important to keep the agricultural footprint the same. So when you're looking at the end use for corn and soybeans, which at least in the Midwest are the most common crops we see, usually in some sort of rotation where solar is going in and replacing them. Almost half of the corn and soybean production in use, according to the USDA's current data, is already being used for energy in the form of biofuels, things like ethanol, biodiesel on the soybean side. So we're seeing those numbers go up significantly over time, where they're not used to feed people or animals. They are being used as biofuels, as an energy resource, similar to a solar plant would be considered, an energy producer as well. So in that sense, you can make the argument that corn and soybean production is already in the energy industry, about half of the use of that. when you look at these human consumption numbers, they may look a little higher than you would anticipate at first glance. But it's important to realize that these aren't like corn and soybeans that you'd see in the vegetable aisle at the grocery store. This is all human consumption. The corn that would be in the vegetable aisle would be sweet corn. That's about 1% of production nationwide. The vast majority of corn is field corn, which is used for food products like high fructose corn syrup, cornmeal, corn flakes, those sorts of things. So even at that 15% of food consumption might not be what people are imagining in these sorts of feed the world conversations. The animal feed is interesting because how you want to engage the community in regards to removing agriculture as it relates to animal feed is going to change depending on how much livestock farming there is in the area. In an area like Kansas, where there is quite a bit of livestock farming, that might be a very important statistic that the community is saying, hey, we need this animal feed because we've got to feed our local community, we'll be able to supply our local farmers, things like that. We don't want their prices to go up. And so you might run into that sort of argument in some communities. Other areas where livestock farming is less prevalent or less present in the community, you might not see that argument quite as much. But something to know about your county, your state that you're working in is what does livestock farming look like there, and how is the removal of corn and soybeans going to affect that? The last thing that we look at for crops and crop production along these lines is what yields are doing, which for corn and soybeans in particular has been going up significantly. If you look at the trends over the past 30 years, it's roughly 1% yield increase annually, which adds up quite a bit. And so what that means is that we need less agricultural land to produce the same amount of corn or same amount of soybeans. As technology improves, as farming gets more efficient and better, we've seen these yields continually go up over time. And so we've done a lot of these analyses right now using solar, a solar project, and the amount of the acreage of agriculture that it's expecting to take out of the community, comparing that to the total agriculture in the county, and seeing how long it will take them to replace the loss of that agricultural land with more efficient production. And for almost all of them, some, quite large projects could take a little bit longer, but it's typically less than a year. And if you've got 50,000 acres of agriculture in a community, you take 1,000 acres out of production, that remaining 49,000 is going to produce the same amount of corn or soybeans that had been produced before the solar project came, usually within a year, within 2 years, so quite quickly. And so that needs to be taken into account in this conversation. And with those yield increases and any increase of corn and soybeans that we're seeing, what we're seeing is the growth in the amount of corn and soybeans being produced. But because those biofuels numbers are going up so rapidly in comparison, that all of the additional corn and soybeans that's being produced, I shouldn't say all, I'm trying not to speak in absolutes because of course there's more nuance there, but by and large that if you're going to produce more corn and soybeans, it's probably because that biofuels is growing so much, it's probably going to that area. So the last question here has to do with your landowners and engaging them that the solar lease is a better economic use from their perspective. This is a pretty clear case in most circumstances that the solar lease is going to be better than their profits from farming from their perspective. If you're comparing the profits from the two, you need to consider not just the farmer's revenue, but also the expenditures and the time invested. So we've run a lot of these land use simulations comparing the solar lease to the expected profits from farming. There are some cases we'll run 500 simulations for each project, and without getting too nerdy about it, they can sort of build on each other. So if a simulation sees the price for corn and soybeans spike, for example, then it'd tend to take that into account into subsequent years. And so it says, hey, if it spiked there, maybe it's going to stay there. Maybe it's going to continue to rise. And so sometimes some of those best case scenarios do end up being higher than the solar lease. But out of the 500, it might be, 2, 5, 10 of them. Typically the landowner, what we've seen in almost all of the ones that we've run, the landowner could be better off in 100% of the simulations taking the solar lease versus profits from farming, given sort of the lease rates that we're seeing in the market and the expected profits from farming. It would take quite a bit, and we've never seen anything close to the landowner having over 50% of simulations being better for agriculture. So that is my presentation today. I will turn things back over to Ethan.
Great, thank you, Bryan. Next up is Chris Thankan. Chris Thankan assists with the production of the economic impact studies, including sourcing, analyzing, and graphing government data, and performing property tax analysis for wind, solar, and transmission projects. Thankan has a Bachelor of Science degree in Sustainable and Renewable Energy and minored in economics.
Thank you very much, Ethan, and hello to you all. Thank you for being with us today. For the last part of our presentation, I'm going to talk about the economic impacts that happen within our preliminary studies. So first, it's good to just show a comparison between our preliminary studies and our detailed studies or normal studies. First thing I want to mention, though, is that there's a lot of similarities between the two. The basic methodology is still the same. We are still using our IMPLAN software, stands for Impact Planning, industry standard software for economic impact modeling. The results set is still the same, so you're still going to get a report that features the direct, indirect, and induced impacts with the units of jobs, earnings, and output. And we still use the same conservative estimations and assumptions that we use for all of our projects, regardless of the study type. Now, the differences are that the preliminary studies use less required inputs from the client. So we only need just a handful of cost data or relevant project data from the client. Whereas our detailed study, we need a project cost input sheet filled out, a lot more estimations or input from the client about money spent in the county and the state. As a result, we have results with higher precision for our detailed studies. Preliminary studies, we make more assumptions on the SER end, on our analysis end, and as a result, we get ballpark level results. But these results are still good for your early stage project because you're trying to gather community support for your project, and those ballpark level results can really communicate the magnitudes. So as for inputs on the solar side, just need 5 things. Really, that's all. Project county and the state, essentially the location of your project, start year for construction, megawatts AC of capacity, total project cost, not just CapEx, any cost that you have, and then an estimation for the number of O&M workers. Whatever you have at the time of your early stage project is probably fine. We can work with that. On the wind side, pretty much the same thing. The only difference is if you have a idea of the number of turbines, that can be really helpful for us calculating our land lease input for our economic modeling. But again, still the same thing, project county and state, construction start year, capacity in megawatts AC, that total project cost, and the number of O&M workers that you expect to be working on the project upon completion. So how is it that we can create an entire report from just those few inputs? Well, we have hundreds of other project costs in a database from our years of analyses. These vary by state, year, developer, technology, etc. So that, along with our software that we use and our industry knowledge, we can fill in those missing costs that are not present, that we're not asking for in these preliminary studies. Again, and this is worth re-emphasizing, we always take great strides to be conservative. The last thing that we want to do at SER is overpromise because we weren't conservative with our assumptions or estimations. I don't want to overpromise economic impacts or property tax in one of our reports. So if you were to order a report from us, a preliminary study, we get those inputs from you, we run it through our modeling after filling in some of the missing inputs from our database of project costs. You'll get a report that is just as good as any of the other normal detailed studies that we do. Again, you'll get those direct, indirect, induced impacts in the forms of jobs, earnings, and output. Really quickly, direct impacts are the on-site personnel impacts happening as a result of construction and operations. Indirect impacts, you can think supply chain impacts as a result of the intermediate inputs that your project needs to be constructed and operated. And then induced impacts are the community spending impacts, where the direct workers and the indirect level workers, they go home to the county and the state, spend their money in the local community, and that spurs more economic activity throughout the area. If you're interested in hearing a more in-depth explanation of those impacts, please go to our Strategic Economic Research YouTube channel and watch our permitting webinar that we did a couple months ago. I go into much more depth about that. But for our preliminary studies, you get those results, and they're great for those early stage community engagement support. You're trying to tell the community the magnitude of the impacts. Again, we did ballpark level results, so now you can go there and say, hey, this is about what you can expect from our project after it's completed. But we're talking about projects with development timelines of years, several years long. And so it's great to do that preliminary study at that early stage, but as your project progresses and gets closer to that permitting stage, we highly, highly recommend that you refresh the study with more specific cost data. Within that development timeline, costs change, county economics change, labor levels change, suppliers within the community and the state change, your vendor contracts change, all these things can change. And so you don't want to go into the permitting hearings with out-of-date economic impacts. We want you to refresh the study with us with the more specific cost data so that we can give you impacts with more precision. And as a result, with that more precision, you're setting the expectation in the community's mind. And as a result, you're gaining greater trust. So before you had ballpark level results, with the refresh study, you're getting more precise results so that when it comes time to actually build and operate your project, you can say, hey, here's what we promised, here's what we delivered. Again, we take great strides to make conservative estimations so that you don't end up in this scenario where you've overpromised and then underdelivered. That's all. We always try to avoid that. And with a refresh study, we can definitely help you get there to that permitting stage. But thanks for listening, and I'll turn it back to Ethan.
Great, thank you, Chris. And we will be transitioning into our Q&A portion of our webinar today. I'm going to have our panelists turn video on, and we've got about 10 minutes here. We might go a little bit longer than that, just because we have a few questions to get through, but I will ask that our panelists keep their answers brief. Our first question here, Timberly, maybe you could start off with this one. It says, we know that renewables projects have fewer jobs than fossil fueled power plants and manufacturing facilities. How do you communicate the value of a renewable project to communities that consider the number of new jobs to be the key benefit?
Yeah, new jobs are critically important to local communities. They want their residents to have those well-paying positions. But I often remind local leaders that the revenue that a landowner can receive from participating in a solar or wind farm is additional income. It supplements what they're already making or can allow them to retire. And those incomes can be quite significant. And that is money that is also usually spent in the community. And so I encourage local leaders to consider that impact in the same way that they do new jobs.
Great. Bryan, there is a question about property taxes. It says, are tax revenues really that significant? Do you have any estimates of ranges of dollars of tax revenue per megawatt hour produced?
Well, the key in that question is range because it does vary widely. It really depends on the state you're in and how they handle their property taxation, if they have a replacement tax in place. So I don't have a figure off the top of my head to share because it is so different for each state. They can vary from a small amount to a very significant amount that will impact the community for years and years to come. So it does depend really on the state. It's a very local issue, but if you have any more specifics about the project that you're looking for, we'd be happy to have a conversation with you and get you some a little better answer than that.
And then I have a follow-up question about property taxes as well. It says, in places where pilot or IRB agreements are likely, how do you communicate about estimated property taxes, given that it's expected that a project may not be actually taxed, but instead will use a pilot? What's the best way to communicate that?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Chris was saying, we always estimate on the conservative side for property taxes and economic impacts. So if a developer is hoping to receive a pilot or IRB, that's our preferred scenario to model because we want to show the community, here's sort of the base case. You always could get more than this if things change. So the only, yeah, I don't want to go into that. I think I'll leave it at that. We will model those pilots or IRBs, and then that can be something that the developer can go to the community with and say, hey, here's what we'd like to do in terms, and we'll list out the terms of that, make sure the developer is aware of the assumptions we use to calculate it, but we're always modeling on the conservative side and then can adjust up if needed. Much better to adjust up than adjust down later in the process generally.
And I'll add to that, many times you need to communicate to local leaders and the communities that a pilot or a tax abatement doesn't mean that the project isn't paying taxes. That's a common misconception. Those pilots or abatements, typically they're just an alternative tax structure that has different tax rates or timelines. And oftentimes they come with an economic development payment, a lump sum that might be paid early in the process of operations. And those types of payments are a big value to communities because typically that money doesn't get allocated like tax money. It's outside of the taxing structure. And so local leaders have more flexibility in how to use that money. And they can put it towards special projects like broadband. And so it's a lot about communicating what an abatement can do for a community as opposed to the misconception that it is just not paying taxes.
Yeah, that's good. Chris, for you, we've got a question here that says, how far along does a project need to be in order to do a study like this? And Timberly, I might have you follow up with that and just talking about your experience and how Tenaska has decided at what point to commission a preliminary study. But Chris, well, how far along does a project generally need to be in order for us to do a study?
Yeah, so as soon as you as the client have those inputs that I mentioned on the solar side and the wind side, just 5, 6 inputs really is all you really need. We can start that study immediately. All it takes is those inputs. We can fill in the rest of the costs, and we can start modeling right away after contracts and whatnot are signed. But generally, early on in the process is when you have those, at least in assumptions about those inputs, send it over to us. Yep.
And then when a client is ready to move forward with a full detailed study, we have a detailed project cost input sheet that you mentioned that breaks out all of their project costs into different categories. And then usually by that time, they've got a better idea of the project area, the project footprint that our property tax team can make more precise estimates as far as the property taxes over the life of the project. So yeah, that's great. Timberly, what about you? Could you just talk about how, at what point in the process of development do you decide to commission either a preliminary or detailed study, and what does that decision-making process look for you?
Yeah, it really is based on our confidence in the project, particularly around the size and the footprint. Because those are key things that we need to be able to provide the inputs to you all. And so typically, for a full study, we wouldn't do that until, I would say, usually mid-development, and we have a lot of confidence in a project. And we use that as the project becomes more and more public to help garner support for the project. For some of these preliminary studies, once we have a sense of size and location, we might commission those earlier to help support a land campaign and to help get landowners interested in the benefits that they could possibly help bring to their community.
Well, that's great. We've got quite a few questions here, limited time, but I did want to do one last question here. And then I'm seeing a lot of questions related to the recording. We will be sending out a recording of this session to all attendees, all registrants, when that is available, hopefully tomorrow, possibly early next week. So last question here says, lots of the opposition is emotion driven and based on disinformation generated by the fossil fuel industry. How are you debunking that information? Economic data is great and necessary, but I'm concerned that opinions are often so locked in, it can be hard to change them. Thoughts on how to address?
It really is in developing a relationship with the community. For you to be seen as believable, they need to trust you. And trust comes with having a relationship. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. So you need to know what the concerns are the community has. Each community has usually a slightly different thing. It could be sound, it could be view shed, it could be water. You have to understand what those key issues are. You have to build trust. And then you have to communicate effectively. And those things take time. It's not going to happen overnight. So you do have to put the work into to build those relationships and establish that trust.
Great.
Yeah, I think the thing I'd add along what you were saying earlier, Timberly, is getting in early, particularly if you're the first proposed project in an area, you'd want to get in early and start providing information before that disinformation has disseminated en masse. So you've got that side of things, as well as the earlier you can engage, the better it's generally going to be on this side. And you're not going to be able to change everyone's mind, like you said, but yeah, being early is definitely a good way to go.
Great. Well, thank you, Timberly, Brian, Chris. Appreciate everyone for attending, and just great to see the engagement and questions being asked. If I did not get to your question, I will be following up with you after the session here. So thank you all for attending. Again, I will be sending out the recording, so you can feel free to share that with whoever might find this information helpful. And if you are interested in having SER perform a preliminary study for your project, please reach out to me. I handle all the proposals and the sales process for the company, so I'd be happy to speak with you about your specific project and what that might look like. So thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.